Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Weaver. I am on faculty as well as staff at Lighthouse Writers Workshop. I have been making a series of videos in which I ask a member of our faculty at Lighthouse a crafting question. So today, Sarah Schantz has joined us. She is going to talk to us a little bit about characterization. Thanks for being here, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
So I mostly am wondering if you have any tips for creating dynamic, interesting characters. You know, what do you do when you're working with a story and you realize, oh, this character is so feeling really flat or just kind of not great? What sort of techniques do you use in your own writing when that happens?
I think one thing that I discovered when I was working on my first novel, Fig, was I have this character in the book called Gran, and she's sort of an old-fashioned woman in Kansas who had hoped that she would marry better than she did, that she would sort of have this more sophisticated elite life than what she ended up with, which was pretty much being a farm wife. And then, you know, so life has been kind of mean to her in a lot of ways. So not only does that become her reality, but then her son, her sort of favorite son, ends up marrying a woman who has schizophrenia and having a granddaughter, Fig. And it's just a messy situation, and she doesn't really know how to apply any of her parenting or people skills. And I kept making her just sort of awful. Like, I think I mistook her as being the antagonist of the book for a long time. And it wasn't until I realized that the true antagonist of the book wasn't a person. It was mental illness and kind of the landscape of Kansas and the time period too, that I realized that I really just couldn't have her do like terrible thing after terrible thing. She wasn't really like a terrible person either. It was just circumstance, and she just didn't know better. And so there's a scene where she has decided that to make Fig a better person, she's going to go to charm school. She's going to have her go to charm school and learn how to be a proper lady, which is probably about the worst possible thing that you could do to the character Fig. And long story short, Fig gets kicked out of charm school for not being charming. And I had, like, originally I was like, oh, that's going to make Gran really upset. And so she's going to make Fig do chores around the house to save up money to get a manicure so that she can get back into charm school, because that's why she got kicked out. And I don't know, it just kept falling flat, and it was not getting the story anywhere. And so I asked myself, what would she really do in this particular situation? And sort of pushed myself also to see, like, I asked myself, what wouldn't she do? Or what would she be afraid to do? And what I realized is, like, all the advice that I had gotten from writing teachers about characterization was always, you know, make sure your character always stays in character. And I've thought a lot about the fact that as real people, we change the most when we step out of our comfort zones, when we try something new, and that's where we grow as people. And that's, you know, what should happen in a novel with any character. Even minor characters should be able to grow, right? So I knew that she wouldn't just be like, okay, Fig got kicked out of charm school, that she would need to keep up the appearances. And so what I did was I had her start to pick Fig up as if she was going to take her to charm school, and they would just drive around Kansas for 3 hours, and then she'd drop her off at home, and they got to keep a secret that way together. They were sort of telling a lie to the rest of the family about what they were doing, but they were also forced to spend time together in this kind of awkward, intimate way of just driving around Kansas. But in the end, Gran becomes this much more interesting character, I think, because she doesn't just do what we would expect her to do. She also doesn't do what we wouldn't expect her to do. And I think that's the tricky part, right? Is maintaining that balance. But now I usually have like students, I have them often have their characters do the opposite of what they think they should do in a situation. And usually that's way more interesting. And we start to actually see who the character is through reaction to a different environment.
Right. I mean, it sounds to me like a lot of what you're doing or you're describing doing is writing through situations to try to figure out more about your character and more about what they might do and might not do. So do you make most of your characterization decisions as you write, or do you think you make them before you start writing these characters?
I think I'd probably do a combination of both. I mean, I know that I'm definitely a character-driven writer over a plot-driven writer. When I know what's going to happen, I often get so bored that I don't care, and I'd rather have my characters show me where we're going. So in that way, I think it's important to know my characters. You know, I mean, I want to as well is what you don't know to some extent, or what the reader won't, like being able to sort of keep up an element of mystery. So things that I do usually want to know about a character, like what are their habits and rituals? Why did the particular bad habit that they have, when did it begin? Why did it begin? I mean, I think we rarely, as real people, have the luxury or the ability to even remember when we started doing X, Y, or Z, but I'm sure that there's some sort of wound or reason behind why we did that. And so there's a reason why, you know, these particular situations are going to trigger us to fall back into the habit of, you know, smoking or chewing on our fingernails or whatever it is. But then ritual and routine is also important, even if it's a character who has absolutely no routine whatsoever. How do you demonstrate that? But again, I think that that's also giving us tools to be able to show their emotions rather than tell them. You know, so if you have a character who tends to start chain smoking when stressed out, you know, that's kind of a cliched and maybe outdated way to show that. But there's other things that you could do. And secrets, I think, are another big one, including the secrets that they don't even realize that they are keeping from themselves. What are the things that they just would never absolutely say ever? I don't know. Yeah.
Right. And so, okay, so my other question is, you work with a lot of students. And so I'm wondering what sort of, like, what are the typical pitfalls that you see with characterization in other people's writing? You know, what are the common problems that arise for writers when they are trying to develop characters, well-rounded characters?
I mean, what, you know, I think being able to well-round the character is one of the big pitfalls. You know, there's either, especially with beginner students, I see a lot of really beautiful, talented, you know, characters that don't necessarily have the flaws that they need to have for us to really relate to them, or the wounds. But then sometimes I think that writers make the mistake of going too far the other way and having these like tragically flawed, impossibly unlikable characters. And I think a lot of it is just that. And then I think also sometimes I think writers have a habit of putting their own emotional truths and experiences onto the page in a way that doesn't feel authentic, so that it's almost like all the characters are only in just them, as opposed to using emotional truths from who you are as a way to have empathy for characters. I think one thing that I like a lot is Hemingway was the one that said that our job as writers isn't to judge our characters, but to understand our characters. So that's a big thing that I see a lot of students do, is that they portray characters in a way where they're passing judgment on them, which doesn't allow the reader to get to make any decisions about who they are.
Right, it takes away that element of discovery and engagement, I think, for the reader.
Absolutely.
It's a hard balance to strike, though, I think, as a writer. It's hard to, I feel like what I do a lot is I overwrite my character and then I underwrite, and then I overwrite and then I underwrite until I find that right spot where the character is presenting themselves in an authentic way, but the reader can still have some room to engage with them and to come to their own conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that, you know, every student is always sort of disappointed to hear how much we end up cutting out of our own work. And so, you know, trying to really stress that just because you cut 300 pages from your first novel doesn't mean that those pages are gone. You know, they are part of the experiment of getting to know these characters enough that you can put them on a page so that other people can then start to form opinions about them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you typically dream up? You said you're a character-driven writer. You feel like you spend more time working with the characters than with the plot, potentially. Do you think that do you spend a lot of time crafting your characters, or do you sort of start with a nugget of maybe someone you know or some way of being in the world and then build from there? I'm interested in how you build a character. Like, what does it start with, and then how do you add to that?
Yeah. So when I was in school for writing, I studied under Bobby Louise Hawkins, and she used to have us do this thing called overheard conversations, where we would have to go out into the world and record people without them knowing, which is totally legal in the state of Colorado, and then transcribe these snippets of conversation, and then she would make us share all of those every single class period. And it was a really good way to sort of learn voice, not just dialogue, but voice in particular. And so I think that I was working on that particular ongoing assignment when I heard the line "every day is a near-death experience," and it just really like clicked and wouldn't let go, I guess. And so I started to try to figure out like who was saying that. And that was how I developed the mother in my first novel. And it's something that she says, and it's the first line of the short story before it became a book. So I think a lot of it is I get a voice in my head, or a particular, if I'm not writing in first person, it's more like an idea of somebody, but I don't really get to know them until I start just writing them on the page. And it's in that process where, like, I wish that there was a way to articulate what the experience is like in some sort of useful way for others. But for me, it feels like being a medium that's somehow channeling these characters that just start kind of coming through me and talking to me and on the page. And usually those are the characters that I can't not pay attention to them. So they end up on the page, and then they kind of, you know, I guess I just start to get to know them more and more. Like, I'll think about them when I'm not writing, when I'm taking walks or taking a bath or driving, that kind of thing. And then I think I start to maybe pose the what if questions, that those situational moments, like, well, what would be the worst possible thing to have happen to this character? Gee, I think there's a story there. But I think it's just a matter, and then I do think that people I know, things will creep into the work, you know, maybe not always in the most, like, I've definitely done some revenge writing in my time, you know, where I will you know, develop a character based upon somebody I know, you know, doing something terrible or making a mistake, and I'm trying to process it. Sometimes I don't even realize that that's what I'm doing until way later. But I think there's a lot to be said about that, especially even though I just called it revenge writing. Like, there's a story that I wrote where I did that. And I remember a review of the story, the critic talked about how like empathetic I was to the main character, despite sort of how tragic and lost and kind of awful the main character was. And that told me that I had done something right, that I had been able to remove like my own personal experience from the story enough to, you know, but even the characters that I don't base off of real people, people often think that they're based off of them anyway. So I don't know.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about characterization. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
I'll see you later.
Okay, sounds good.
Bye.
Bye.